Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Dr. John Turner, author of Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet. Go to gospeltangents.com/contest. You could win this book right here. In our next conversation, I'm going to ask John to rank the previous Joseph Smith biographies, Fawn Brodie, Richard Bushman, Dan Vogel, and see where he sits on that. We'll also dive into Joseph's early life and some of the first vision controversies. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. So as we'll shift gears here and go back into the Joseph Smith biography. I think kind of the main biographies over the years have been, of course, Fawn Brodie, but it's now 70 years old, 80 years old. And then Richard Bushman has a big one. I know Richard Van Wagner has one.
Dan
Vogel's got two.
Yeah.
Can you talk, maybe we'll set yours aside for a minute, but can you talk about the strengths and weaknesses of some of those other biographies and why you felt like you could come in and say something new?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, you might expect somebody writing us on a subject. Maybe one does that because the existing efforts aren't great, right? So that's not really how I approach this project. When I wrote Brigham Young, I would say that I found the most extensive non-Mormon, sort of more critical biography of Brigham Young very inadequate. It was a biography from Stanley Hirschson back in the early 1970s. And I don't think he'd really spent any time in Utah looking at sources here. So it's totally inadequate. And honestly, I thought Leonard Arrington's biography, while really helpful in terms of engaging more sources, I thought it was very uncritical and, just not very penetrating on some key issues. Great book in many ways, and really helpful in terms of pointing me to a lot of sources. But I think he left a lot of stones unturned. With Joseph Smith, I feel rather differently. I'm actually a really warm admirer of all of the biographies that you just mentioned. So, yes, Fawn Brodie's biography is really out of date. She's a fantastic writer and was able to accomplish what she did without access to many of the sources that researchers today would take for granted as extremely well known. So, hats off to her. That's pretty remarkable for 1945. I'm an enormous admirer of Richard Bushman as a person and a scholar. So Roughstone Rolling it expertly contextualizes Joseph's life in the culture of the early 19th century United States. And I think Richard Bushman is a fantastic writer as well, and he had tremendous access to sources.
But no Joseph Smith papers either.
No Joseph Smith papers. And Dan Vogel, he's a really diligent researcher. His early Mormon documents collection, especially before the Joseph Smith papers, that's been an essential resource for historians. So in this case, it's not that these other biographies stink, so I've got to write a good one. It's more that there are some great biographies of Joseph Smith, and I suppose I want to write a different one. I want to write one that, in some ways, I think is better or does justice to different parts of Joseph's personality. But it was a real advantage to work on a figure whose life has been studied so intensively and penetratingly by many different historians.
So was it, for me, it would be intimidating to even approach a book like this.
Mhm.
But was it intimidating to you with Brodie, Bushman, Vogel, even Richard Van Wagner, Natural Born
Yeah.
Seer, when there's so many good ones out there? Or
And Martha Bradley's Glorious in Persecution, so to complete that trinity. Well, no, I wouldn't say it was intimidating. I'll tell you why. I think if you start out to write a biography and you go through topic by topic and think about what other people have said and how you want to position what you're saying, I don't think that's the best approach.
okay,
What what I essentially do, and I did the same thing for Brigham Young, is I try my best just to. I mean, I've read these other biographies before, but when I really got into the marrow of the project, it's simply go through all the sources for myself and start there. And which honestly, in this case, it was often going through the Joseph Smith Papers volumes and website. Read the latest scholarship on both Joseph Smith and early Mormonism, but also some other scholarship on the time period. So really just try to immerse myself in Joseph Smith and his world and make sense of it for myself. And I also didn't think there's reason for intimidation because as you've mentioned, these other individuals have written great biographies of Joseph Smith from their own perspectives and their own position vis-a-vis the movement. And I simply trusted that there would be room for my perspective from my position. And I hope that was true.
well, and it's a great book. I know with Richard Bushman, when I talked to him about Roughstone Rolling, he felt like, I may be putting this not in his words, but from my perspective, it seemed like, Fawn Brodie's book was so popular. She was technically Mormon, but she was very critical of Joseph Smith, that's for sure. And so this was more of a kind of a faithful perspective, but he and of course, even 20 years ago when Bushman came out with his, Fawn's was dated then, but he always felt, from my perspective, it seems like he said that hers was still kind of, he hadn't knocked her off the perch of the best Joseph Smith biography, because she's a great writer. She was an English major, and and I'm wondering, is your book going to replace Fawn Brodie as the favorite?
Well, I'm not a prophet, so I'm not gonna hazard a prediction. I think I don't really know how that works. I think, if you look at Amazon's rankings of best-selling books in Mormonism, it's always John Krakauer's Under the Banner of
Yeah.
Heaven.
But I don't know. He's
And
not a scholar, that's for
but
sure.
and Richard Bushman's biography and Fawn Brodie's are both up there. I think it's sort of what might popular, ordinary readers go to first? Who knows? I mean, I think certainly over the last 20 years, Richard Bushman's became the go-to biography for any scholar or seriously interested party in Joseph Smith. So, I can understand and empathize perhaps with him lamenting the difficulty of knocking her off the perch. I think he got on a pretty good perch himself. So, we'll just see.
Okay. How does Dan Vogel fit in there?
Um, I think I don't think that I don't think that Dan's books achieved the wide readership that either Fawn Brodie's No Man Knows My History or Bushman's Roughstone Rolling were able to achieve. But that's not to detract from his accomplishments. as I said, I mean, he has been such a diligent and successful researcher and author in many respects. So, early Mormon documents, Joseph Smith, The Making of a Prophet.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
His more recent 1830s biography, and his book on
Charisma Under Pressure. Is that what you're
Charisma
talking
Under
about?
Pressure. Thank you. And his book on Book of Abraham apologetics. So he is one of the more significant historians of Mormonism in this generation. Absolutely.
So, do I dare ask you for your ranking of those three?
No, I'm not going to rank them because, especially if it involves a number of people that I like.
Well, very good.
I mean, I like my own biography the most. So, yeah.
So this one's number one right here. It's also the newest. And I know Rick Turley's coming out with a new one probably 10 years before his is out, though.
I mean, who knows? Rick is pretty indefatigable as well. So there's always more room for
Yeah.
Joseph Smith biographers. I mean, I say at the end that, because of the nature of Joseph Smith's life and his many activities and the controversies that surround them, by that I mean Americans in general, but also historians and biographers will never be finished with Joseph Smith. So they're going to be, there'll be scores of Joseph Smith biographies in the coming decades.
Well, you're already looking over your shoulder at Rick Turley, right? See what he comes up with.
I'm just glad I got to the finish line.
Well, cool. Well, as we dive into your book, what I'd like to talk about is kind of the early time period of his life. Was there anything, I think, for people who've read Bushman or Brodie or Vogel, I mean, a lot of us are probably familiar with that, but was there anything in Joseph's early life that kind of surprised you as you started through this? I know you didn't start with the volcano like Saints volume does.
So, anything that really surprised me? Well, I think one thing that I have to say at the outset, which complicates any discussion, I think, of Joseph Smith before around 1829, is we know very little. And most of what we know comes from a small number of sources, or at least we only have a small number of sources that discuss those events in any detail. So there's the biography of Lucy Mack Smith that she dictates in 1844, quite a few decades after many of these events.
And Brigham wasn't a fan of that one.
Brigham wasn't a fan of that one. It's a great source, but for many things, it's the only source we have to go on, which is a little troublesome. Joseph himself doesn't talk about his childhood in any depth and detail. He doesn't say that much in his histories. Occasionally in his sermons, he'll allude to something in his childhood. So all of that is to say, I wish I had discovered amazing new things about his childhood and early years, but that's really not the case. And I think these are very tricky years to write about because there are recollections of folks in Palmyra who really were not too impressed with Joseph Smith and his family, and later created records along those lines. So in a way, we don't have a lot of sources. The sources that we do have are rather fouled up and divergent. One thing I would say is that sometimes there's a tendency in a famous figure like Joseph Smith, and maybe this is particularly true of religious leaders, I don't know, to try to find signs of their future greatness or trajectory in their childhood. And among the things that most stands out to me about Joseph's childhood is that there was nothing that prefigured this, in my opinion. I mean, he's not a center of attention in his family when he's growing up. His mother only writes about him in any detail when she gets to the leg operation when he almost dies as a boy. Um, Otherwise, he's not. When he starts growing up, they don't look at him and think he's predestined for prophetic greatness. And I think into the early 1820s, the family really has its hopes for leadership pinned on Alvin. And it's only after Alvin's 1823 death that Joseph really begins to occupy center stage in the household, and he begins to develop into the leader that we recognize.
Okay. I guess we should start diving into the controversies then, and I'd like to see where you weigh in on some of those. Among, say, Orthodox Latter-day Saints, and Dan Vogel goes into this quite a bit. We look at the dating of the first vision, and Dan notes some anachronisms and that sort of a thing. Was it 1820, 1823, 1824? Were there revivals in 1820? Some say yes, some say no. Where do you weigh in on that?
So it's a great question. And to be frank, I have long found some of those debates a little bit tiresome.
That would not surprise me.
So, there's
They're more faith
yeah,
questions than
well,
historical.
they're two, and I don't mind faith questions, and I'm willing to engage them some of the time. In terms of the vision, I think it's so fraught, partly because the church has placed so much weight on it. I think President Gordon B. Hinckley said something along the lines of, well, if the first vision isn't true, if it didn't happen, then this whole work is a fraud and collapses. Um, Kind of a bold thing for a church president to say, in a way. Um, and so then it sort of becomes this question of, well, if one can poke holes in the first vision account, does the whole edifice collapse? And as an outsider, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because as an academic historian, can I weigh in on whether the particulars of any given account of the first vision, such as the canonical Joseph Smith history, are true? Not really. It's really hard to recreate any conversation a week after the fact, let alone 12 or 18 years after the fact. So the particulars, I think they are more of a matter of faith um, than of history. I do think the idea that this all collapses if there wasn't a huge revival in Palmyra in the spring of 1820, or if this vision actually took place in 1821 or 1823. I mean, that to me is a somewhat,
Who cares?
well, it's an exacting standard, right, for the truth of something. What I say in the book, and I probably should have led with the lead, right? What I say in the book is, for me, there's no reason to doubt the core of the story, that a young man troubled about the state of his soul, troubled about the churches that surrounded him, saw, and heard the Lord. And I say that because Joseph grew up in a visionary household. His parents had dreams and visions. He had a maternal grandfather who had a powerful visionary conversion. And visions tend to follow cultural scripts and patterns. And if one accepts the general validity of visions, then it is not surprising that one would have one oneself. So, given Joseph's uh, family, given the culture that he lived in, I don't find it hard to believe that he had a powerful religious experience as a young man. All of the accounts of the first vision do. I mean, they're different, but they do share some common themes: a concern about the apostasy of other churches, which I think tracks with Joseph Smith Sr.'s stance and young Joseph's stance as well. They all include at least a vision of Jesus Christ. Yes, there are two personages in the canonical account and probably only Jesus Christ in the 1832 account. But there, I don't see any reason to deny that Joseph had a vision. Exactly what it contained, I don't think that's accessible to us as historians.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. John Turner, author of The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet. So this is an amazing book. You should get it if you don't win one. You could win one at gospeltangents.com/contest. I'll be drawing for that at the conclusion of this interview. In our next conversation, I'm going to ask what John thinks of the Book of Mormon.
This is a really unlikely literary success, right? I mean, it's not a bestseller at the time, but it's done pretty well in the years since. It had serious legs. I see this not as primarily an act of deception,
That's interesting.
but as an act of audacity. I mean, it's really a harebrained scheme. And Joseph pulls it off.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt, so check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.